As the EU has frozen the European assets of RT by sanctioning our parent company, Ano TV Novosti. The restrictions are part of the latest ninth round of EU sanctions against Russia. This comes after Western politicians and the mainstream media repeatedly criticised Russian outlets, including RT and its German, Spanish, French language channels for airing what the Europeans called propaganda and Kremlin talking points. Well, we're now joined by George Samueli, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute. George, many thanks for joining us on the programme. I'd just like to know what you make of the latest sanctions on RT's parent company, including the freezing of assets. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's very amusing that on this very day, a number of EU politicians are sounding off about Twitter suspending a few journalists in the United States. They're very indignant about that. In the meantime, they're essentially outlawing a whole bunch of TV and radio networks whose only crime is that they're providing information that the EU doesn't like. Of course, it's in violation of all of the international covenants that EU has signed. It's in violation of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. It's in violation of the EU treaty. But then they say, well, it's a propaganda. Well, one man's news is another man's propaganda. A lot of people might think that what you get on BBC and CNN is also smacks of propaganda. So this is just par for the course for EU and US hypocrisy.
So what do you think this asset freeze means for the future of RT in Europe?
Well, to be honest, I don't see RT returning anytime soon because fundamentally, the break between Europe and Russia is now so fundamental that it's hard to see how any kind of normality can be restored, at least for the foreseeable future, at least maybe for the next generation. So, and of course, it's a great shame because it means that the Europeans don't get to hear the other side of the story. And given that there's a serious conflict taking place between NATO and Russia, and given that this conflict could easily escalate into something even more serious, now is the most important time to get to hear the other side of the story. And the EU is absolutely determined to prevent Europeans from hearing this.
George, can we read into the timing of these sanctions in any way? Why is this asset freeze happening right now?
Well, I think it's just that there's an ongoing need to keep ratcheting up the pressure. I mean, to be honest, the EU, NATO, the United States, they don't have anything very much going for them. The war isn't going particularly well for them. So they have to keep moving along to suggest that they are actually doing something and that they are somehow making a difference. The one thing, of course, they don't want to do it under any circumstances is to see some kind of a negotiated outcome as possible. That is always ruled out.
So the EU has tried to justify its sanctions by claiming that RT spreads disinformation. What's your take on that explanation?
Well, what they call disinformation is information that they don't like. It's a perspective that they want to deny to the European public. Now, anybody can look at the BBC's website. They can go to CNN and go to Deutsche Welle. And what do you get there? You get propaganda and you get disinformation. The EU wants to somehow suggest that very one-sided presentation is somehow objective and it's sort of proper information. Well, of course it isn't. So essentially what they call disinformation is just simply the information that they don't like that contradicts their take on what's going on in Ukraine.
So I suppose you can look at this one of two ways. It's either about fighting so-called propaganda or cracking down on media freedom.
Well, of course, it is cracking down on media freedom, but I think what's so important for them is that they want to make sure that nobody gets to hear facts and information that challenges the European, NATO, United States interpretation of what's going on in Ukraine and the origins and history of the conflict. Very important that nobody gets to hear it, and instead they just hear the propaganda line, which is Ukraine good, Russia bad, NATO wonderful, and that they want to just keep banging it into the heads of the Europeans. I mean, it's no different from any kind of what one could call a totalitarian state, where you just have a state propaganda mouthpiece, and everybody has to accept as true what the propaganda spokesman declare to be true.
So what's the worst that can happen, George? If people are informed from all angles, what's the big risk here?
Well, the big risk, and it's a very serious risk for the Ursula von der Leyens of the world, is that people will, wake up and ask, why the hell are we here? How on earth did we get ourselves into this horrific conflict in a country that is not a member of NATO, is not a member of the European Union, and over an issue that has never been a matter of vital interest to Europe, namely the eastern border of Ukraine. How did this suddenly become an existential matter for hundreds of millions of Europeans? And once you ask that question, then of course there's the danger that people are going to get angry and they're going to go out into the street and ask, you're leading us into a possible nuclear war. You already led us to an economic disaster. And for what? Why are we here? And of course, those are the questions that Ursula von der Leyen and Josep Borrell and Charles Michel, those are the questions that they're absolutely determined to prevent people from asking.
I do feel like in the past few months that amid the economic situation, a few people, and a minority of course, are asking more questions like, how did we get here? Why have we chosen this situation? But do you expect any Western journalists to now question or even criticise this latest asset freeze?
No, I don't think Western journalists will criticize it. They're, as I said, they're much too busy getting indignant about a handful of journalists getting suspended by Twitter. Completely unimportant. It's an absolutely trivial dispute that they got into with Elon Musk. That the Western journalists are very agitated and indignant about. But the idea of sort of essentially banning vast broadcasting networks that provide a contrary view, at the very moment when it is absolutely essential that we do hear a contrary view before we go down the path towards nuclear conflict, that they're perfectly happy with. They don't offer any criticism, just as they haven't, the mainstream media have not offered any criticism of the policies of the EU and the United States that has led this continent into a horrific economic mess, but above all into a very dangerous confrontation, the kind of confrontation that for decades Western leaders have tried to avoid.
It's no secret that RT carries an alternative viewpoint. Our slogan is question more. We always aim to bring the stories that aren't in the mainstream headlines. And of course, that includes what's happening in Ukraine and across Europe right now. So do you think our Western viewers will continue watching regardless of the sanctions?
Well, I think so. I think if people want to find out, other information, things that isn't available in Western media, yeah, there are ways to still find out. RT, there are channels where RT is available. There are ways still to receive RT. All kinds of things that you can do. You play with on the internet. I don't want to spell them out. And yeah, there'll be certainly people who want information, they will go and get it. But unfortunately, it means that it's very limited who gets it. And one should also point out that there is a persecution of people who want to appear on RT, who get invited to appear on RT. They, in some countries, are now, could find themselves in danger of legal prosecution. So that's another aspect that should not be forgotten, that there's a real serious threat to anyone who wants to take part in RT shows, that they could face they could be in legal jeopardy.
Well, we always appreciate your loyalty and your time, George. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. That's George Samueli, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.